Be good to go.
Use chat separate. So we'll save stuff in notes and all that. How coaches have to do all this stuff too.
Hello?
Hey, Liane?
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess everybody at Short Ridge, we'll just do this we're just gonna bring you in via phone as we work through the other issues.
Okay. Sorry. I can't
Hey,
even
don't worry.
sign in because I don't have an account.
Don't worry about it. We are experiencing live technical difficulties. We're gonna get started right away. So I'll
So
try
you want me to call in on my phone here?
No, you're good. Everyone can hear you right now. So we'll get started in a second, and then you'll just go with the flow from your phone.
Hello, I'm Zellars. I'm going to be doing the interview today.
Hey,
So,
Zip, can you adjust your camera down a little bit so we can see your face? Thanks.
better?
Yep.
Sorry about that. So, I am a senior at Short Ridge High School. I am part of the Diplomatic Corps, Model UN, Chinese National Honor Society, and I also play football and golf for the school. Today, we are going to be interviewing Liane Groth Hulka. Liane is a 1997 graduate of North Central High School in Indianapolis. After graduating from Indiana University in 2001, she served a year as Governor's Fellow under the late Governor Frank O'Bannon. Before graduating from Muir School of Law in 2005, she started her career as a litigation associate for a large law firm in Indianapolis. She worked in Indiana General Assembly as an assistant majority counsel for the Indiana House Democrats from 2007 to 2008. She is a Chapter 13 bankruptcy attorney for the trustee Ann Delaney. Liane enjoys consulting with political campaigns and school referendums. Liane has been a political commentator for Fox 59 and Wish TV. She is currently board chair of the Washington Township Foundation and serves as the 5th District Congressional Chair for the Indiana Democratic Party. Most recently, Liane co-founded the nonprofit Vote Safe Indiana, advocating for greater enfranchisement amongst voting Hoosiers. Welcome, Liane. So,
So she got disconnected. We're going to need to
okay.
get back. Mr. Pachter, do you want to call her back and I can talk a little bit about how to register to vote?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, she's back.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. So, how are you today?
She got disconnected. We're going to need to
Okay.
get back. Mr. Pachter, do you want to call her back and I can talk a little bit about how to register to vote?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, she's back.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, Ziv, go ahead.
She got disconnected. We're going to need to get back. Mr. Pachter.
So, Liane, can you give us a little information on how to register to vote in the state of Indiana? With the elections coming up in November, this is more meant for our seniors, but can you go into the process of registering to vote?
Absolutely. So, first of all, thank you, Zip, for the introduction. Thank you for having me speak about voting today. Sierra High School, Short Ridge has such a great long history of tradition of graduating really excellent students that are ready to make a difference in the world. I love this class and I'm happy to be here, or this idea, and happy to be here. So registering to vote, you can go to indianavoters.org and register there. You can register online. You can also visit your local county election board. A lot of people don't know where that is, and fill out a form in person. But for most people, the easiest thing to do is to go online and register to vote by, and you can mail your, you actually have to present like a form of identification. It has to be a state issued ID. That was a particular law that was challenged, and unfortunately it was lost, but you do have to also sign, give your signature as well, and kind of remember what signature that is, because it comes into play if you choose a certain voting option later down the road, which is an absentee ballot, where they do look at your signatures. And the deadline to vote for this general election is October 5th. It's usually about a month before the election. Some states have same-day registration where you can go to the polls and register to vote at the same time. Unfortunately, in Indiana, we do not. So it's October 5th, and for those students on the call here today that may say, well, I'm only 14 years old, I'm only 15, this doesn't apply to me, there's probably people that you live with or your neighbors that aren't registered to vote. In Indiana, actually, we have, in 2016, only 68% of eligible voters in this state were registered to vote. That means 4.5 million voters were unregistered. And so there's probably, you know, with those odds, you're going to know, even if you are not old enough to register to vote yourself, you're going to know somebody that is. And so you can tell them how to register to vote, and make sure they know that October 5th deadline for this election.
Thank you. So you kind of touched into it briefly there, but why should our freshmen at the school care about voting when they can't?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of reasons. The first one is what I mentioned earlier. You can help people you live with, your neighbors, your friends that are of voting age. You can register to vote when you're 17 as long as you're going to be 18 by the election. And then you probably all, you know people that are seniors that are eligible to vote, and you can be influential in making sure they register to vote too. But I think, you know, younger people should care about this because it's important that the second, you know, you hit an election where you're going to be 18 years old, that you get yourself registered. So the great news is, as long as you continue to live in, you know, Marion County, but as long as you continue to live there, you will not be purged from the rolls. It's not like you have to register to vote every single time you go to an election. Once you're registered to vote, you are in the voter database as a registered voter who's eligible to vote. And so it's just really important there's a group called vote.org. They are a national group, and their executive director actually lives in Indianapolis and wanted to be on this call today, but couldn't make it. But they have a national initiative called Pledge to Reg, and you can go on vote.org and take the pledge, and you actually put in your cell phone number or your email, and they will send you reminders up until the time you can vote. So you'll be in their system even if you're only 14 years old, and in 3 years they'll remember you, and they will make sure that you have all the tools you need to register to vote.
That's amazing. So another question, this kind of gets down to nitty-gritty details, but do you know what the current turnout rates amongst young people in Indiana are for voting?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact numbers, but they are not, I can tell you this, that turnout under 30-year-old voters and younger. So anywhere between 18 and 30 years old is nearly half of what the turnout for voters over the age of 65 is. So what that means is that people 65 and older in this state are dictating who are our elected leaders, and And young people, while it's important that everyone knows, they actually make up a majority of the population, voting population, if they were to all come out and vote. So the power that young people have is significant in selecting leaders and a direction in this country if young people would register to vote and turn out to vote. I can tell you that I think we've already gone over that there are 4.5 million unregistered voters in Indiana, but there's about 68% of the state is registered. But out of the 68% of registered voters in Indiana, only a little more than half, about 58% of them came out to vote in 2016. That turnout, in fact, Indiana ranks in the bottom 10 in the entire country for voter turnout. So it really is an indication that we may not have leaders that reflect the true will of the people that live in this state.
Okay. Well, then that kind of goes into another question is, do you know like what barriers might my generation be facing when it comes to voting?
Sure. So there's actually, unfortunately, several barriers that young people face for voting. And we think that some of the reason the turnout is so low among young people is that they don't understand really how to register to vote. And in Indiana, unfortunately, there's several restrictive laws that just don't make voting easier. They make it harder. One example is how I mentioned earlier that you have to be registered to vote like a month before the election. In many states, you can just walk into the polls and say, hey, I'm not registered, but I'm here, I want to vote. Can you sign me up? And they'll let you vote. Here, you have to be registered a month before the election. So that's certainly a barrier to voting, because if it's October 6th and suddenly you decide to tune into the election, or you take a great class and your teacher says, like, helps you understand the importance of participating, it's too late. You can't vote in that election. If you are one day past that deadline, you have to wait until the next election. So that's one barrier. There are unfortunately several other barriers. Another one is if you decide to choose, and let me pivot a little bit and talk about the different types of voting before I talk about the barriers. In Indiana, you can vote, you can walk into the polls and stand in line. Usually there's lines on election day, unfortunately, and you can vote in person. In Marion County, where probably most of you live, is what we call a vote center county. And that is kind of a new development, which is pretty cool. It means it used to be, polling places used to be based on the precinct in which you live, your voting precinct. And so you'd have to go, let's say it was like the Lutheran church across the street, and that was your polling place, and that's where you'd have to show up to vote. And if you showed up anywhere else, they wouldn't have your name on their polling book. But now in Marion County, you can actually go to any voting center and vote. So even though you may want to vote in the Lutheran church across from, your high school or your house or whatever, you could be up at a doctor's appointment on the northwest side of town in Marion County and walk into a polling place next door there. So that's a pretty cool thing that Marion County is doing. Not all counties we have 92 counties in this state, and not all counties do that. But that you can do in-person voting. There's also something called absentee voting, or mail-in voting. You guys might have heard a lot about that in the news lately with, President Trump saying, trying to defund the Postal Service, and people worrying about what that means when they're mailing in their ballots. But in Indiana, we do not have a mail-in ballot system. What we have is a two-step process for an absentee ballot voting process. So you have to actually apply for your absentee ballot, and again, the deadline on that is I think like 12 days before the election. So for this election, for example, you have to apply for your absentee ballot by October 22nd. So that's several days before the election. And then once you apply, as long as you meet that deadline, then you'll get sent an absentee ballot in the mail. Now, another restriction is not everybody right now, as the law exists, can request an absentee ballot. You have to meet certain excuses. One of them, the most well-known one, is you can be if you're over the age of 65, you can automatically apply for an absentee ballot. The other ones are you're going to be confined at home due to an illness, and there's been some debate as to whether that illness is the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, and there's a lot of confusion. And unfortunately, none of our state leaders have clarified that excuse, the illness, as being the pandemic. So there is a pending lawsuit right now it's up at the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals up in Chicago, and they are going to decide what that actually means and whether all people can request an absentee ballot for the general election. But of course, time is ticking, as the deadline to apply for an absentee ballot is October 22nd. So there's the deadline to apply for an absentee ballot, and then the other restriction is when you mail in your absentee ballot after you filled it out, it has to be received by the county election board by noon on election day. So note that noon on election day is not even the same as the time the polls close, which is 6 o'clock on election day. So for whatever reason, they make people choosing to vote by absentee ballot, they make them get their votes in before the end of the day. And that law, there's a lawsuit challenging that right now, which is currently pending in federal court. But there are a lot of people that voted in the primary whose ballots, they mailed them well before election day, but their ballots arrived election day and they were thrown out. So we call this silent disenfranchisement. So these people are voting by absentee ballot, mailing their ballots in, and they're not arriving on time, and they don't even know that their vote didn't count. So, and there used to be another restriction, which was just overturned by the federal courts here, and that was, remember when we were talking about registering to vote, and I said you had to sign your application and they would remember that signature. When you sign your absentee ballot and mail it back in, they match up that signature to your voter registration to make sure that you are the person you say you are filling out your ballot. Now, the problem is, that people were throwing out a lot of ballots because the signatures didn't match. But now, because we have a ruling from a judge saying that rule, that law in Indiana, where their signatures have to match, is unconstitutional. They can't just toss you out. They actually now have to give you notice and a chance to correct. And so that we think that's a very good thing in helping people's votes actually count. So you can see there is unfortunately a lot of restrictions on voting and disenfranchisement, silent disenfranchisement issues going on here. But the key is probably education and making sure you know these rules. But other states, it's so much easier to vote, and why we don't make it easier for people to vote in Indiana is probably why we are in the bottom 10 of turnout. So, like, for example, in Colorado, every single person is mailed, if you're registered to vote, you are mailed a ballot. You don't have to apply for a ballot. You don't have to walk into a poll. You're mailed a ballot. You fill it out, and there's drop boxes. You can either drop it back off, or you can mail it with the postal service. And here it's just very difficult. We are more of an in-person state where you're expected to actually show up at the polls. And you know what? If there's 3-hour wait, you are also expected to take 3 hours of your day waiting in line. So.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Can you give us a little information about the organization you formed, Vote Safe
Sure.
Indiana?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Vote Safe Indiana came about right around when the pandemic hit. I started this organization with a couple of other activists who we quickly recognized that, voting is important, yet there would be even additional greater restrictions on access to the polls and ballots when we're in the middle of this pandemic. And in particular, we knew in the primary, the state leadership actually gave everybody a chance to vote absentee. And they said, you don't need an excuse. We're going to eliminate that law for a short period of time because we're in a pandemic. And if you're too scared to go into the polls and wait in line because you don't want to catch coronavirus, we'll let you vote, apply for an absentee ballot. You don't need to list an excuse, and then you can just mail it back in. And that's when we really started paying attention to some of these restrictive laws that we mentioned, which one in particular, the having to get your ballot, having your ballot be received by noon on election day. We knew there's so many people that didn't understand that restrictive deadline, so we actually advocated to get the state to not only eliminate the excuse you need to vote absentee, but to accept ballots that were postmarked on or before election day up to 6 days after the election. Because I don't know if you guys have ever mailed anything recently, but the Postal Service is just under a lot of stress right now. Financially, with employees are getting, just like any other workplace, people are getting sick, and it's harder for them to process large amounts of mail. So things that, I can give you an example, like we mailed a card just a greeting card to our grandparents that live in the same zip code, and it took 5 days. And a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, it would have just taken about a day to get there. So we knew this could disenfranchise a lot of people, so we started advocating for that change. And we eventually joined a coalition of voting rights groups in Indiana that were really pushing for the same thing. Some were pushing for more people to register to vote. Some groups were pushing for a total change in our system to move it all over to mail-in voting. But now we've kind of all joined together, and we're trying to strategize about how we can achieve the greatest voting turnout, make sure the greatest number of votes are actually counted and nobody's disenfranchised, and that people can do it safely. And one thing we're working on right now, which I think is pretty cool, is we're working with some tech people that are volunteering their time on creating a website and then we're going to have a field organization where people will be tracking wait times in Marion County. And so you can actually, if your employer, for example, only gives you an hour off that day, which is unfortunate, but you can kind of shop around and see what the shortest line is, because we believe, the longer people have to wait in line, the less safe it becomes to vote. But we also believe it's such an important constitutional right that we have to be a voice about who we want our leadership to be, that we got to do everything we can to make sure people can vote and get through the line safely.
One other question about your organization would be how do you encourage more people to engage with your organization and volunteers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we will be looking for volunteers to work the polls on election day, to kind of monitor the lines, to help people understand that there is actually a voting rights hotline that they can call if they have any questions about voting or see anything that might be illegal. And so we're looking for volunteers there, but we decided, unfortunately, the state leadership, the governor, the secretary of state, the Indiana Election Commission, which governs elections in the state, they did not hear us. We had editorials all over the state, media appearances, and you name it. We did the best we could to get the word out about, advocating for safer voting and lessening the restrictions on or barriers to voting. So we were not successful. Nobody budged. So we kind of shifted gears to just educating people about the process. So we will be soon, probably in the next couple of weeks, we will be posting on social media graphics and information that people need on how to vote safely and make sure their vote counts. So what we would ask people to do is, follow Vote Safe Indiana on social media, continue to tweet out any of the educational pieces so that we can get the word out across as far and wide as we can about how to vote safely, so that people know the restrictions and know what to expect, and know that they can create what we're calling, know your vote plan, know your voting plan. How are you going to vote? And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in Marion County, another cool thing we have is they actually open up certain vote centers 10 days before the election, 28 days before the election, which is October 6th. You can actually go to the city-county building and you can vote. So voting, when you hear everybody say, 50 days until election day, really, you got to count down from that 28 days, because you can actually start voting in the state on October 6th. And a lot of people don't know that. And our theory is the more people you can drive to early voting, the less lines there'll be, and the safer it will be to vote on election day. And if the more people that vote absentee, that's the less people in line on election day. But you can actually vote at the city county building at the election office there downtown, starting October 6th, and then 10 days before the election, they have certain vote centers open all across the county, and you can go there basically Monday through Friday and on the weekends too. So that's pretty cool.
Okay. So you participated in the Hoosier Women Forward program.
Yes.
So what was the application process like, and how was that experience?
So Hoosier Women Forward is a nonprofit, political nonprofit that I co-founded, and it doesn't quite relate to voting, but I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit. We take, especially for some of the seniors that we take women that are 25 and older that are existing leaders in their community, and we help translate those leadership skills they've developed into democratic leadership skills. So we try to engage them into the Democratic Party, and it's a 9-month training program, leadership training program. And the application process, you just answer a series of essays about yourself, talk about why you care about progressive politics and are interested in getting more involved. And then we do kind of a competitive selection process from there. But I'd love to get it on all the women listening here, their radar, Hoosier Women Forward, for when they're 25. But it's been a great networking group around the state. It's a pipeline group for people that are already doing amazing things and making a difference in the world. So I'm super proud to be a co-founder of that. The Republican women in the state actually started a similar program long before the Democrats started Hoosier Women Forward. And so they also have a leadership training program, and that's called the Lugar Series. They started over 28 years ago. And the Democrats just got around a few years ago to getting something similar started. So both are very successful, valuable programs that I'd encourage any women to apply for.
So there were some questions asked by our student body. Someone wanted to know, can people under the age of 18 volunteer on election day to do certain things, or is that restricted to only voters?
That's a great question. So certainly, if you're not of voting age, you can still volunteer for like a campaign at the polls. You can volunteer for our election protection program, which is actually our Voting Rights Coalition is working on that. And you can kind of monitor lines and absolutely. In fact, I've got high school students that have reached out to me that already want to sign up to work the polls. The question as to whether you can actually work inside the polls as a poll worker, they always need poll workers. I don't know the answer to that. I thought you had to be 18, but I could be wrong. But they always need people to work inside the polls. And then, but there is something like called like vote counting. So you're actually counting the absentee ballots. That's part of a tedious process that takes quite some time. And I don't believe you have to be 18. I don't even think you have to live in the county in which you're counting ballots. So, but those are great questions. I can get the exact age on what you need for the poll worker and the ballot counters, and I can follow up with you there.
So, just coming to kind of the end of our questions, but so for some of our students who are eligible to vote, what advice would you have for them?
Know your voting plan. Look at the early voting options. Look at the absentee ballot and see if one of the excuses applies to you. I will say there is a pretty good shot that we could be successful on that lawsuit, and we might have an answer by the end of the month, which could eliminate all the excuses, meaning everybody 18 and older can vote by absentee ballot if they want to. But remember, you have to apply for it. And that deadline is October 22nd. So I would say by the end of the month, end of September, start thinking about how you're going to vote. Are you going to go in person early voting and stand in line? Are you going? And you remember, you can do that starting October 6th at the county election board. Are you going to request an absentee ballot and mail it in? And I will say that once you get that ballot in your hand, mail it in as soon as you can. In Marion County, the other thing you can do if you fill out an absentee, once you get your ballot, is you can actually walk it into any vote center polling place. So they have a separate line now for people turning in their absentee ballots. So you bypass, there might be a 2-hour line out the door, but if you just tell them I'm returning my ballot, and you can walk it into any voting site and they will accept it for you. That's what they did in the primary. It was very, very, very helpful and successful in getting people's votes counted, because if those people that had those ballots on election day tried to put them in the mail, they would arrive at the election board office well after the election and they would have been thrown out. And I should also make a note on that. There's another lawsuit challenging that deadline. So it's possible that maybe those votes that were thrown out in the primary won't, in years past, won't be thrown out again. But I can't emphasize enough, know your voting plan. How are you going to vote? I think Michelle Obama might have said this in her Democratic National Convention speech. The earlier you can vote, as soon as the polls open, try to vote, whether it's absentee or early voting, but just get out there. If you wait till election day, that's fine. You can go, but the risk of standing in line is probably going to be high, because it's the 2020 general election. It's a presidential year, as you know, so lines could be long. So unless you have, that might be part of your voting plan. Hey, I'm going to take off a half day and just stand in line as long as it takes to get to vote, and that's okay too, but just know your plan. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that luxury of taking off, a half day to make sure they get their vote counted on election day. It's too bad that has to be the case. Some people only have an hour. So if you just have, an hour out of your day on election day to vote, or maybe you can only go before or after work, it might be a good option for you to look into early voting and getting that done before election day, maybe on a weekend if you're not working.
So another student asked about.
It's the voice from the background. I'm sorry, but we need to wrap up. So if you want to, thank you, blah blah blah. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for listening in, and thank you, Liane, for speaking to our student body today. It was an amazing
Thank you
experience.
so much for having me. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry I couldn't get there in person, but stay safe and register to vote.